Today, I'd like to talk about the importance of determining the right governance model for my nonprofit. Maybe I should say choosing the right governance model for my nonprofit. The governance model can be a lever for efficiency, engagement, and shared vision, which is why I'm motivated to talk to you about it today. So, what is a governance model? The governance model is the system or approach chosen by the board to ensure a culture of accountability towards the organization's stakeholders. There are three main types of governance models, the most common ones that we see out there. The first one is management-oriented governance. The second one is results and oversight-oriented governance. And the third one is purpose and results-oriented governance, or policy governance. We're going to look at all three of those today and try to decipher the differences between the three to ultimately be able to give you tips and tricks on how to determine the best governance model for your organization, for your nonprofit. So, a few key points to remember here. The governance model should support the board's efficiency and effectiveness. The governance model should also contribute to the organization's success. The governance model should not be a distraction for the executive director. For example, if the governance model is not suited to the organization's reality, it can become an administrative burden for the executive director. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the video. The governance model guides the organization towards a clear and engaging vision. And also remember that the governance model enhances the team cohesion through a clear understanding of roles and responsibilities and an equitable and effective distribution of tasks. And most importantly, the best governance model for your nonprofit will be the one that is realistic and attainable by your organization. So let's talk about what are the main characteristics of these governance models to try to see which one best fits your organization, for example. So the first one is management-oriented governance model. This one tends to be more participatory and operational. So a few characteristics here that I want to go through. The bylaws may be more or less detailed. These types of nonprofits usually have little to no governance or internal policies. Typically, there will not be a governance committee, but possibly operational committees. And we'll go into this a bit later, but ultimately, what these boards all have in common, these boards that usually have this type of governance model, is that they're smaller. And we're in a situation in these smaller organizations where sometimes the board will be doing everything. So the board, of course, handles the governance aspect, but the board is also ultimately responsible for delivering programs and services. So no governance committee, but possibly operational committees like communications committee, finance committee, events planning committee. These are boards where board members will have operational tasks, as I was saying earlier. Board meetings tend to be more frequent for these types of organizations, and there is no executive director or management team, but possibly employees, for example, project officer or project coordinators. This requires a higher time commitment for the directors of the board. So more meetings, or more frequent meetings, I should say, activities in which the directors are expected to participate. And there's also the preparation time, which is common to any board. This model, this governance model, is useful when you have few or no employees. It's useful when you have a small budget, so when there are not sufficient resources to develop the governance model. Also useful for organizations that focus on one specific event. So the whole mission of the organization is focused on a specific event, for example, a music festival. This model is also useful if your board is small and, like I was saying earlier, you lack, the resources to develop the governance model. The second one I want to talk about is results-oriented governance model. This one tends to be more prescriptive and focused on monitoring. So what does this look like? Main characteristics of organizations that have this governance model, there might be less detailed bylaws because we have a lot of the information that is found in the governance policies. For example, board mandate, committee mandates, director mandates, and all that kind of thing. The policies will be more prescriptive and focused on expectations. What do we expect of directors and officers? What do we expect of the executive director, etc.? It is also typically, organizations in which board members are active in board committees. So the three main board committees that we see most often I should say, are Finance Committee, Finance Audit Committee, Governance Committee, and also Compensation and Evaluation, Executive Director Compensation and Evaluation Committee. So board members in this governance model will be more active and fully engaged in committee work. There's usually presence of permanent consultation structures in these organizations. So I like to describe it as a feedback loop. So structured ways of soliciting and getting feedback on satisfaction, needs, and tendencies in our markets. So permanent consultation structures which allow the organization to constantly have information around client beneficiary satisfaction, employee satisfaction, partner satisfaction. Also, what are the main trends in our sector, and what are the needs that are maybe not being met? So another characteristic of an organization that has this governance model is the presence of permanent consultation structures. These types of organizations will usually have fewer board meetings and more committee meetings. The model we see most often is alternating meetings. So every other month there's a board meeting, and the months where the board doesn't meet are reserved for committee meetings. Smaller management team is also a characteristic of this type of organization that has this governance model. Usually also clearly defined strategic priorities and organizational performance metrics. There's usually in these organizations a high level of assurance of strategic and operational performance. The board is sometimes more involved in developing internal policies in this governance model, and there's a moderate time commitment. Commitment for board members is focused on preparation and committee work, but it's less involvement in less frequent meetings equals less time necessary from the directors. I'm not saying it doesn't necessitate time, just maybe less than board members who would sit on an operational board, for example, which is the previous governance model. So this governance model is useful when an executive director is in place. It's useful when this executive director is supported by internal staff, for example, an executive assistant, service or sector directors, governance support services, and things of that nature. Also useful for organizations that have multiple programs and services, organizations in which the funding is diversified and the budget is relatively significant. Also useful when you're dealing with an organization where the board members are engaged and participative in committees, they're prepared, they can think strategically, and they are there for it all. And the last one is purpose-oriented governance model. This one is a model that will be more strategic and limitative. A few characteristics: the bylaws will be even less detailed. There will be governance policies that are focused on purpose and limitations of power. The board will be involved in interpretation of policies and really involved in compliance monitoring. That's a big chunk of what they'll be doing. The organizations that typically have this governance model have a large internal management team. These boards almost exclusively operate within a strategic framework. The board is not involved in developing internal policies because let's remember there's a team, a large internal management team with specialized directors, specialized managers, for example, a human resources department that is led by a human resources expert. So why would the board be working on HR policies and procedures when there is the expertise internally to make sure that we have those policies in place and that they are in accordance with the laws and regulations we are obligated to follow as a nonprofit. This governance model also necessitates a moderate time commitment. Directors and officers will be expected, of course, to be well prepared and participate in committee work, but the time commitment is moderate compared to the two other governance models that we looked at a bit earlier. So this type of governance model is useful when you have a large management team with several employees. It's typical of larger organizations that operate within an institutional setting. Think about colleges, universities, hospitals, school boards. And that's what I mean when I say NGO here, non-governmental organization. I'm not necessarily talking about the United Nations here. We're trying to bring it to the level of the nonprofits that we know in our network. But this governance model is really typical of those bigger institutions. Again, like I was saying previously, the colleges, the universities, the hospitals, where there is a lot of staff and large specialized management team. Like I was saying earlier, typical of organizations that have several departments that are led by specialized service directors, managers. Also, another thing that's typical about these organizations is they'll have a staff member that is internally dedicated to supporting board work, a governance professional, for example. And now, tips and tricks. So, the number one trap here is choosing a model that is too demanding for the available resources. For example, if you have a board that does everything, an operational board, trying to function with a policy-based governance model is probably not going to serve the organization very well. So the trap here is choosing a model that is too demanding for the available resources. The risk is burning out board members or even creating role confusion. So the tip here is to align the model with your team size, your organization's budget, and your operational capacity. Remember, the best governance model for your organization is the one that you can achieve, the one that is achievable. The impact is maintaining volunteer engagement, while ensuring realistic and, like I was saying before, effective governance. The second trap is not evolving toward a more strategic model as the organization grows. So I'm going to put a picture in your head here. Picture the small organization that starts with, a small group of 7 really motivated board members. And for, 5 to 7 years, they're grinding and they're getting, funding and they're building their organization and they're putting together programs and services and they're doing it all as a board. Eventually, 5 to 7 years, they find themselves in better financial posture. They have hired an executive director. They might have 1 or 2 department heads, management-wise, but they still have an operational governance model. What is the risk here? The risk is that sticking with an overly participatory and operational governance structure, despite growing services and resources, can have unwelcomed risks or consequences for your board. For example, you're going from an small operational board that does everything to a board that is mainly there for oversight, but it's not clearly understood and the governance model has not followed. You're going to have directors and officers that are constantly overstepping in the executive director's roles and responsibilities. So the tip here is, as an organization, to periodically reassess the relevance of the model as the organizational complexity increases, as the programs and services grow, as the internal team grows, as the financial capacity grows. The impact here is, well, if you do that, if you periodically reassess and make sure that the governance model is following the evolution of the organization, you are enabling the organization to focus on long-term vision and outcomes. So you have a board that's focused on oversight, monitoring of the executive director's work, a strategic board, rather than having an operational board who's constantly overstepping on the executive director's roles and responsibilities. And the third trap I want to share with you is confusing governance and management. Kind of ties into the second one, but I just wanted to, go into it a little bit more detail. So the risk here is blurring board and executive roles, which can weaken strategic decision making. Therefore, it's important to clarify the roles through well-defined policies or accountability frameworks, especially for our executive director, and clarifying roles for directors and officers as well will keep us from overstepping or blurring the lines between governance and management. This will allow your board to strengthen cohesion and organizational effectiveness by ensuring that the roles are complementary. Executive director and board's role are complementary. They should not be antagonistic, and there should be as little overstepping as possible to avoid all types of mishaps. So I hope I've given you a few ideas to maybe reflect and think about your organization. What does your governance model look like? And if you're someone who's just starting out a nonprofit or even thinking of starting a nonprofit, what is the best governance model for my organization are all questions that you could be asking yourself. So I'm hoping that in here you have found something that'll be useful for your reflection, or something that maybe you can bring to your board for consideration.